Hi everyone, welcome to this channel. Today we are exploring the origins of the name of Massachusetts. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. In 1620, English settlers, many of whom were religious pilgrims, arrived on the Mayflower in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, forming the second permanent settlement of British colonists in the New World, after Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. A larger group of English Puritans followed soon after and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Indigenous peoples had been living on the land for thousands of years, and the colony was named for the Massachusett tribe, making the Bay State the first of the colonies to be given an indigenous name. The name Massachusett comes from the Algonquin word Massa-adchu-es-et, which roughly translates as Great Hill Small Place. So while we won't be able to explore every little detail of the early colonial days today, I think it's very interesting that the Pilgrims chose to name their new settlement after one of the local tribes. And I know we're going to get a lot of people commenting that the Pilgrims would not have done this if they had a choice. They likely felt that naming it after a local tribe was a better option than trying to come up with some far-fetched English name that would have fit in with their other colonies. We'll explore that idea more later on. But before we do that, let's go back even further to learn about the indigenous peoples who originally inhabited the land we now call Massachusetts. The earliest evidence of human activity in Massachusetts dates back 12,000 years or more to the Paleo-Indian period, which began after the last ice age. These nomadic people hunted wild game and gathered food and plants. Over time, these early inhabitants spread throughout eastern North America and eventually made their way into what is now Massachusetts. By the time Europeans arrived, the area was home to several different tribes, including the Massachusett, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Pennacook, among others. The Massachusett tribe is believed to have migrated to the area around 1,000 years ago from the north. They lived in small villages and were skilled farmers, growing corn, squash, and beans. They also hunted deer and other animals and fished in the abundant rivers and streams. Their society was organized into clans with a chief at the head. Religion played a central role in daily life, and they believed that nature was sacred, and they had a deep respect for the environment. They were animistic, believing that natural objects such as trees, rivers, and mountains were inhabited by spirits, and they held ceremonies to honor these spirits. When the Mayflower arrived carrying the first European settlers in 1620, the Massachusett people had been living in the region for centuries. At this point, they numbered around 3,000 to 4,000 and occupied a territory that encompassed much of what is now eastern Massachusetts, including the area around present-day Boston. The Massachusett were one of the most advanced tribes in New England, with a sophisticated social structure and a deep knowledge of their environment. They were also known for their craftsmanship, creating items such as baskets, pottery, and tools with great skill. The arrival of the Europeans, however, would have a devastating impact on the Massachusett and other indigenous tribes in the area. As the colonies grew, the settlers encroached on tribal lands, bringing diseases that devastated Native American populations who had no immunity to them. And as the settlers continued to push westward, the tribes were pushed further and further to the edges of their territories until there were none left in Massachusetts. Now let's talk about how the Massachusetts people became the namesake of the state. As mentioned earlier, when the Mayflower arrived in 1620, the area was inhabited by several different tribes, but primarily by the Massachusett and the Wampanoag. The Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower were English settlers seeking to establish a new colony in North America. They chose the name Massachusetts because it was familiar to them and reflected the region's geographic features. In fact, the name has quite the interesting origin. The Pilgrims didn't just randomly choose the name out of thin air. It actually comes from the Massachusett language. And unfortunately, there's some conflicting theories on exactly how it happened, but the most popular theory suggests that the name comes from the Massachusetts word Massa-adchu-es-et, which roughly translates as at the great hill, little town, or village. This makes sense because the Pilgrims settled near an area that had a large hill and a few small villages. However, another theory suggests that the name actually comes from the Wampanoag word Massachusett, which means great chief. This could refer to the fact that the Wampanoag Confederacy was led by a powerful chief named Massachusett at the time of the Pilgrims' arrival. However, this theory is less popular because the Wampanoag did not live in the area where the Pilgrims settled. Instead, they lived further south in what is now Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. Regardless of the exact origin of the name, it is clear that the Pilgrims were aware of the local tribes and their culture, and why they chose to use the name Massachusetts instead of coming up with a random English name is still debated by historians. Some argue that they simply chose the name because it was already in use and well known by the local population. Others argue that the Pilgrims were actually respectful of the indigenous people and wanted to honor them by using their language and customs. It's hard to say exactly why the Pilgrims chose to use the name Massachusetts, but it does seem clear that they were aware of the local tribes and their culture, and they seem to be pretty open to learning from them. William Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony, wrote extensively about the interactions between the Pilgrims and the local tribes. In his journal, he described the help that the Pilgrims received from the Wampanoag chief Massachusett and his son, who taught them how to grow crops and fish. He also wrote about the Thanksgiving feast that was shared by both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag in 1621, which is now celebrated annually in the United States as a national holiday. Unfortunately, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag did not last. As the colonies grew, the settlers encroached on tribal lands, and conflicts over land and resources led to violence. But in the early days, it seems that the Pilgrims were open to learning from the indigenous people, and they may have even considered it an honor to use their name for their new colony. This brings us to the question, would the Pilgrims have named the colony after themselves if they had a choice? The answer is probably yes. Most historians agree that the Pilgrims were very attached to their English identity, and they wanted to make that clear in their new colony. They were not trying to create a new English province, but rather an extension of England itself. They brought with them their language, customs, and laws, and they sought to create a community that was as close to their homeland as possible. In fact, the Pilgrims specifically chose the location for their colony because it reminded them of England. They landed in an area that had rolling hills and dense forests, which reminded them of their homeland. They also chose to build their homes in a style that was similar to English villages, with small cottages and thatched roofs. They even brought with them seeds and plants from England in order to create a garden that was familiar to them. While the Pilgrims may have been open to learning from the indigenous people in the area, they ultimately wanted to create a colony that was an extension of England. Therefore, if they had a choice, they would have named the colony after themselves instead of after the local tribes. Ultimately, the name Massachusetts reflects the unique history of the colony and its early interactions with the indigenous tribes. While the Pilgrims were ultimately unsuccessful in creating a colony that was truly English, they did leave behind a legacy that continues to shape the United States today. Thank you all for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Which fact surprised you the most? Let me know down below in the comments section. And while you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode.